welcome to Radical Engagements here at Barblog. And today I'm dealing with a request that was made. And that request was for me to cover the bond market and the points I've been trying to make about the bond market in regards to both the Mamdani campaign and in general, as it's been the hill on which a lot of progressive municipal governors, mayors, and other parts of municipal government have died on. But it's also a problem for like tax the rich schemes at a national level. And I'm not going to cover that today. I'm going to do an explainer on a Barblog solo on Monday. Happy holidays, by the way. This is recorded the day I'm releasing it, so it tells you that I'm finally caught up with my backlog. I'm going to create some backlog soon, though. Don't worry about that. And we're going to go back to the mug reader. We're going to eventually start that third worldism explainer. We're going to deal with I'm going to go back to also releasing some videos on, I think I am going to cover Plato's politics because they were weird, but those have been massive research endeavors. So I'm still going to have to keep these daily solos up and these radical engagements, so you'll get all kinds of stuff. I'm also going to start covering more articles than just the mug reader, but it is coming back. But it's Christmas. I didn't have time to record enough for this week. I took some time for myself and to deal with my other job, which is a larger portion of my weekly workload. Anyway, so we'll get right to it. You don't care about that. This is by David I. Backer. Backer is an associate professor of education policy at Seton Hall University, and he focuses on finance and ideology, and particularly focuses on the financing of schools, which often depends on the bond market. So we'll get to this article that he wrote called Paying for It back a few months ago for the Baffler. Let me pull that up so you can follow along. And of course, as always, it'll be linked in the screen. This is from October of this year, October 29th. To riff off an old meme, what doth capital? Specifically, the capital of the outlay. How do governments get the money they spend? Now, I'm going to add, this is very different from national governments. Okay. National governments have the power of the purse. They can print money. They have what we might call currency sovereignty. And that is they can print money and they can tax on that money, which is a closed loop that makes both Keynesianism and monetary theory work, sort of. And I'm going to get to on Monday the issues with that. But anyway, do we know this CapEx face of capital with its coursing currents of borrowing and limiting the infrastructure of infrastructure? As socialists take executive offices at the municipal level, returning to sewer socialism yet again, we've gone through, we need to focus on, we've too much localism. We need to focus on the national. Oh, we can't take the national. Let's go to the municipal. You should focus on state legislatures first if you were going to follow anything like how you would actually structurally change governments. But that's just me. Anyway, an attempt to realize their ambitions for the working class, they have to grapple with this often misunderstood area of subnational public finance, easily dismissible by those claiming to traffic in cold hard facts. See Zohran Mamdani, the Democratic nominee for mayor of New York City, and the launch of his Green Healthy Schools initiative during the primary. This platform, with its accompanying policy paper, got a headline in The Nation. Where for a sustainability in education proposal with more glowing coverage than typical for Jacobin. Of course, Jacobin is always gilding the lily these days. In response, centrist centralized, a typical news item in Politico characterizes policy among several others proposed by the campaign as a free-for-all for which the Democratic Socialists would have a tough time paying the tab. The cost of green, healthy schools was one target among several Mamdani's proposals in the hit piece, alongside free buses and public housing construction. Of course, they're going to go after social infrastructure. That's like, they want to privatize all that. But what stands as unhelpful free-for-all in this situation? Is it that Mamdani's campaign proposal to make schools healthier and safer, or the regime in place that is supposed to finance public infrastructure? In New York City and pretty much everywhere else, 75% of all said infrastructure is funded through securities sold on the municipal bond market because they don't want to raise taxes directly. And just to explain this to you, cities have two ways to get money because they are not currency sovereign. They can't print their own money. They can raise taxes directly, or they can debt finance off of municipal bonds, which is hoping that you can leverage tax revenues later to pay back the bonds as they mature. And since bonds have maturation rates, that means that you can predict when you're going to get hit with the cost of this debt. It's a fiscal mechanism really took hold in the mid 20th century as a way to finance the government, particularly after it was used extensively during World War I and World War II. Right. Bonds are, of course, much older than that. They're not new, but we'll get there. Whose stated purpose is to use the efficiency of the market competition to allocate credit to the state and local governments for capital needs. Valued at $4 trillion, the market has more than 90,000 state and local government issuers selling over 1 million unique securities in the United States, purchased by investors the world over, tying even local governments into the Forex pool. And for those of you who know, when I say Forex, it means foreign currency exchange pool. Foreign currency exchange pool is largely based off the basket of currencies that people want to be paid in, which is going to be set by two things: bond market buying and the holding of bond markets as the holding of bonds as a safe investment, and your ability to purchase in that country. When none of those are true and you're not dominated by Forex, you get dominated by some kind of commodity, be it the petrodollar, oil, or gold. Historically was the most common, electrum in the deep past. All right. I can go over all of those things later, though. We're not going to get into the deep history of economics here. Whose stated purpose is to use the efficiency of the market competition to allocate credit to state and local governments for capital needs? Valued at $4 trillion, blah, 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 blah. We mentioned this. Compared to the corporate bond market, where there are only 4,000 issuers. So public bonds have way more than private bonds. Mandami's school proposal would depend on such a bond called a building aid revenue bond. BARBs are sold by New York City Transnational Finance Authority, NYC TFA, as a semi-autonomous entity with its own leadership through which the city issues debt to pay for its infrastructure. So it's kind of like the Fed, but for New York City. A recent bond statement from the NYC TFA selling nearly 1.4 billion in BARBs is revealing. In 2026, the city will have to pay 157 million in debt services for them. That's just paying back the interest. According to the deal structure decided by a group of lawyers, consultants, and city wonks, very few of whom are elected, that number will go up to 600 million in 2027. As part of those payments, about 22 million will go towards interest on these loans in the first year of repayment, and approximately 68 million the following. That's 90 million spent just on interest in 2 years. And this is happening all over the country. This is usually the bank that progressive mayors actually die on. This is part of what's killing Brandon Johnson in Chicago. These numbers compose a slice of the 3.4 billion in yearly debt payments to the New York City Department of Education made for its budgets in 2025 and 2026. Around 8% of its entire budget, and roughly the cost of Mandani's school proposal. We are spending the money on these progressive proposals on bond interest, and that's what people aren't talking about. But that's also why trying to do a lot of municipal policy runs up against the hard wall of buying interest, because the other way you're going to do this is raise direct taxation, and there's a limit to how much you can do that without capital flight at a city level for sure. At 3.8 billion, his infrastructure would run into the state government statutory limits on the city's outstanding debt. The cap in the case of Barb's is 9.4 billion, of which some 7.2 billion is already outstanding. This occurs under a threat of a credit rating downgrade, making the borrowing all the more punitive, meaning it's just going to cost you more to service the debt. These bonds get a credit rating decided by the same agencies that give permissive ratings to toxic mortgage debt and ushered in the 2028 financial crisis, and are doing the same thing now, actually, with these data centers, which have junk bond level interest rates on their returns of like 6.8%, but have A plus ratings. They did this with the subprime debt market too, by the way. Barbs have a lower credit rating than other forms of city debt, making them more expensive per dollar borrowed than others. All this money goes to investors and private banks, the latter of which are listed at the front of the publicly available, but not publicly comprehensible, bond statements as underwriters. In the case of the NYTFA's recent Barbs, many of the names will be familiar to those of you who have campaigned against finance capital. Bank of America, RCB Capital Markets, Barclays, Morgan Stanley, and others may be less familiar. Ramirez & Co. Incorporated, Blaylock Van, LLC, Academy Securities Incorporated, etc. These underwriters and their investors must be paid back before other funds are spent, before the teachers are paid, before the mold is remediated, before the city government can do what it's promised. If the city were to go into fiscal trouble and face the decision between paying teachers and paying bondholders, it would have to pay bondholders, and that's what's happened when cities have gone bankrupt in court. With the straps consisting of credit ratings and debt limits and relatively autonomous borrowing authorities and bondholder supremacy, this straitjacket is a national arrangement impacting every municipality which wants to build something or offer public provision, socialist or otherwise. If Mamdani is elected mayor, the administration will have to put on the jacket, as every mayor before him has had to do, and as any socialist taking up the executive branch on a local level will have to do. And when you make all the heyday like Eric Blanc does about sewer socialists, they weren't under these bond market constraints the way these governors are now. This is what crushed Kucinich when he was mayor of Cleveland. This is what is crushing Brandon Johnson now. And when you can't deliver on things you promised because you're so tied up in the bond markets, and yet you're having to tax higher or find other ways of getting revenue to fix that, you start becoming unpopular because you're costing people money without giving them benefits. When socialists do this, this makes socialists look stupid, because it is. Which is why you want to focus on the legislature, because the legislature can change these structures in a way a mayor can't. God damn it, people. All right. With straps consisting of credit rating and debt limits and relatively autonomous borrowing authorities and bondholder supremacy, straitjacket is national arrangement impacting every municipality that wants to build something or offer some public provision, socialist or otherwise. If Mamdani is elected mayor, and he was, the administration will have to put on the jacket like every mayor before him had to, and as any socialist talking about the executive branch on local level will have to do. To do anything, they will need to sell, repay using tax money, and refinance bonds through a shadow government of unelected technocrats manipulating a market so complex and barely anyone understands it. The most advanced research on the subject calls the situation opaque, for the benefit not of the public, but for those holding the bonds, so that you can do public goods afterwards. I'm adding that last part, but it's what you have to understand. So your socialist moderate proposal from Mamdani would only work if you actually take on the entire bondholder infrastructure. But no one wants to do that because it would lead to increased direct taxation if cities wanted to pay for anything, or more federal grants, because the feds have the power of currency sovereignty. Local entities don't. All right. I should confess that I myself am a bondholder. It was an experiment. After having to give up a public pension due to changing jobs and needing to decide what to do with the money, I decided to invest in the municipal bond market to see what it was like. The aforementioned NYC was selling several 20-year bonds for general capital expenditures like building maintenance. I feel good about putting my little investments into loan to my city to help pay for the infrastructure that I crossed to get around, making a tidy return of roughly 4.5% yield, which, is higher than inflation at least. And that's the trade-off with bonds. Bonds usually have, a high-rated bond has a percentage yield that's decent. It usually outpaces inflation, but just barely. But it is a way that you can actually save. That return is fixed, so while I know that I'll make that return, it also wouldn't get higher than that, which it might be if I put the money in the stock market. That being said, the money wouldn't be taxed as income by the federal government. No, it's not. With some caveats, of course, speaking in broad terms, a $1 billion bond with a 4.5% yield would make an investor's $45 million in tax-free income. And that's why they're used. That's why they're so held, because you're not going to get hit on them with the same kind of thing you're going to get hit on the stock market. And yes, these big companies are investing tons in the stock market, but they do that often by leveraging debt. They leverage the cost of the debt versus the gains on the stock market. And what they don't do, they do with bonds. And they do that with bonds, because they go into the government, are not taxed as income. Now, maybe you will start to understanding the financial situation socialists are digging themselves into if they're trying to say that they can do this from the mayor's office without substantive reforms to the entire structure of municipal and state governments. Not just in one state, by the way. This is almost everywhere. But I also know that a chunk of my money wouldn't go to the city for its bridges or other public infrastructure. It would rather go to Moody's for its service of rating the bonds, and to the lawyers making sure the bonds were legal, and to some mixture of the more than 25 banks acting as underwriters in the fiscal architecture. I also knew that my mayor and city council, no matter how socialist, would have little leverage over the protocols and practices set up by the NYC. Some of those managers are unelected. Most of them are in most places. We know for the same bond statement referenced above that the authority is administered by 5 directors like the city council, speaker, and comptroller, but perhaps more important for its day-to-day work is run by its own set of officers and staff members who are appointed by its directors, serving in crisscrossing roles throughout the city's public finance apparatus. David M. Womack is the executive director, but is also deputy director of finance and policy and the coordinator at the Office of Management and Budget of the city. Womack's career has taken him from Citigroup to Rice Financial Products to Braylock Van LLC, all finance deal desks, the last one of which is one of the city's main underwriters. While Citigroup in 2003, it was important to Womack to push through the relatively risky bonds to finance a $45 million charter school affiliated with the infamous education management organization Edison Schools for Washington, D.C., a paradigm case for anti-democratic public financing for private institutions, while whole school districts like Philadelphia were fought to prevent from taking over. There are few rights that residents have in the face of bondholder demands. Most importantly, perhaps, the officials put in charge of governing the city by the supposedly sovereign people have little recourse or room to maneuver in the face of their power. Take Chicago, for example. Let's see how Brandon Johnson has been doing this. A former teacher union organizer, and Cook County Commissioner Brandon Johnson was elected the mayor in 2003. He was very popular at the time against a very unpopular Lori Lightfoot. He ran a successful campaign against Paul Vallis, former budget director under the mayor Richard Daley, who, after leading the charge of selling toxic swamps to finance city programs, oversaw the charterization of a third of Philadelphia's schools. Vallis became a master of disaster capitalism, charterizing the entire New Orleans public schools in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. I do remember this, and I hate this motherfucker for that reason. And then exporting those protocols domestically to Bridgeport, Connecticut, and then abroad to Haiti and Chile. So we don't ever just keep this shit at home. We spread it around like it's an STI. All right. Chicago wanted something different and saw a new horizon with Johnson. Like Mamdani, he came out of an ascendant left coalition of organizers, unionists, and socialists of all kinds, although he wasn't endorsed by the local DSA chapter, as they like to remind me. Johnson's victory was seen as a defeat of neoliberalism and austerity, just as Mamdani's promises to be. Yet, despite the ideological and political alignment across the mayor's office, Board of Education, and union leadership, Johnson had to put on a straitjacket, inheriting a perennial budget crisis where bonds played the crucial role. See also Dennis Kucinich. According to the mayor's office, this crisis was brought about in part by a problematic $175 million pension contribution payment. The pension, serving the school support staff, had for years been covered by the city of Chicago, paid from the city budget. To lessen the pressure of her own budget woes, a few years before Johnson took office in 2019, the previous mayor, Lori Lightfoot, put on an intergovernmental cost-sharing agreement in place, forcing the district to reimburse the city. This move elicited outrage from the school district and the increasingly powerful Chicago's teachers union, where Johnson had been an organizer. By the time Johnson was mayor, backed by the Chicago Teachers Union and communities around the school, there's pressure on him to have the city cover the rogue pension payment that Lightfoot had saddled the schools with. Yet Johnson had to ask the schools to pay this reimbursement to the city since it had already budgeted the payment, making the same argument as his predecessor, whom he heavily critiqued. Without that reimbursement, it'd be harder for Johnson to finance his agenda. When educational leaders asked how the schools facing their own budget crunch were supposed to make the pension payment reimbursement, Johnson recommended the school district sell an emergency bond to help repay the city. So spreading it around. The school district would have to take on new debt, paying millions more in interest, fees, and underwriters, discounts on top of the principal it'll have to pay back down the line. It's cannibalizing the future for the current at high interest. The way municipal finance works in this country, it was either debt or more austerity for the city and the schools, because it's very hard to raise property taxes, probably for good reason. That's also going to hurt people. The school, and including renters, by the way, before you get on that. The renters are going to pay it. It's going to come downstream. The school board, many of whose members Johnson had appointed himself after mass resignations of the previous board, chose austerity and voted against the new debt. Without the new bond from the schools to pay the city back, Johnson was left with a 1.15 billion deficit to escape from, which he now has to wriggle out as Trump calls for him to be imprisoned. His approval rating struggles to get above 30%. The straitjacket is only getting tighter. And this happened with Dennis Kucinich in the 70s too. I keep bringing this up because I've seen it before. All right. There are literally half a century of data on this since these debt instruments were used to start getting around raising taxation as a means for financing cities more and more in the second half of the 20th century. And honestly, it started under Fordism, not just neoliberalism. You can't just blame it on neoliberalism, children. Many of you don't even know what neoliberalism really is. You just think it's like globalization or something. Anyway, a common refrain in the past decade and more is that we should tax the rich to provide for the people. Again, Chicago proves instructive. As Mamdani has proposed to tax the wealthiest New Yorkers, Johnson attempted to pass a new city real estate tax transfer that would apply properties over $1 million in the city. Called the Bring Chicago Home, the initiative would have made a flat real estate tax on property sales as a progressive one, whereas the city had taken $3.75 for every $500 of property sales. Johnson's tax would decrease the rate for properties under $1 million to $3 and increase it to $10 for properties over $1 million, which doesn't seem that unreasonable. New tax went to referendums. Voters defeated the proposal with 52% voting no. Organizers reflecting on the campaign noted that the real estate industry was able to effectively lie in the public debate about what the tax would do, where the money would come from, and how it would address things like crime and homelessness. And this happens a lot. But let's say the referendum had passed and the proposed Bring Chicago Home Board was in charge of disputing the revenues in by the transfer tax. Where would these revenues go? Rather than the simple matter of taxing the real estate transactions and spending it to house the homeless, the city would have to go to issue bonds through the Chicago Housing Authority, which is how it funds its housing development agenda, meaning that such revenue would be redirected in large part to pay off the debt. So even raising taxes on the rich pays the rich. I'm going to repeat that for you so you get it through your skulls. Even raising taxes on the rich goes to pay the rich. Similarly, in New York, taxing the city's wealthiest would send some of the people's money circulating through private credit markets directly back to be taxed. There are entire ruling class industries, financial consultants, credit raters, bond counselors, underwriters, bond insurance sales on the market side, and committees and subcommittees and consultants on the government side working hand in hand, often populated by the same people, like in the case of Walmart, that take in billions of public dollars to make opaque and fragmented regime of credit allocation function, which no one, and I do mean no one, including yours truly or anyone I know who works in understanding and studying finance, can explain in all cases, because the laws are opaque and divided over not just 50 states, but all kinds of municipalities across the country. This is not an argument against taxing the rich, of course. It would help pay off the debt and provide more public programs, as a millionaire's tax does in Massachusetts. But a non-negligible percentage of that money will be returned to the millionaire rankles. Experts largely don't know the full amount here, but we can do some guesswork about how much leaks out. With the interest rates from 0.5 point to 4 or 5%, if they're junk, it's like 6.5. And the cost of issuance ranging from 1 to 10% of loans principal, states and localities are constantly forced to see savings from potentially lower rates or novel reimbursement programs. A grab bag of different instruments have evolved for local governments to contort themselves and get dips out of the stingy and Byzantine spigot available to them for public infrastructure. Anticipation notes, revenue bonds, certificates of participation. Even if the socialist mayoral administration wins a bitter fight to tax the rich, it won't be as fully free as long as the bond regime is in place. Meaning you're going to have to pay off all the public debts and then legislatively rewrite how you deal with that in the future. Or you need some kind of massive land reform. That would take maybe even international law to do, because this stuff is covered under national trade deals and whatnot. It is not just covered by the same federal municipal law. So good fucking luck with that. So yeah, tax the rich. Have Jackman write great stuff about it, because a lot of the people involved seem to seriously not want to look at how governments are funding and why these progressive mayors fail consistently. We say it's because Brandon Johnson's a bad politician, but he's a bad politician to make promises that he can't keep. We'll see how this works out for the DSA today. Mamdani's already signaling to bondholders that he will be somewhat consistent with Adams and de Blasio, putting some of even Obama's neoliberal people in his cabinet, particularly for housing. It's going to be interesting to see what that does and how many of you lie to yourselves about it. Now, there'll be people who make excuses for this and say, well, we didn't win this, and this. Then why did you go for the mayorship first? Well, we just had an opening. Okay, but you had an opening and now you have to do something with it, or you're going to pay for that opening. There's an opportunity cost that people never factor in, and constantly making excuses that socialists don't control enough of the city government to do what socialists need to do isn't really going to make anyone have faith in socialists when they go to elect them, since they're not coming in on slates that can clearly do that. That's not even dealing with the other issues that have come out of the Mamdani campaign and the DSA's tensions around that. Anyway, back to the article. How to escape the straitjacket. The federal government could do any number of things to dismantle the municipal bond regime. including the provisions of no-cost loans directly lent through the Federal Reserve and Treasury, institutionalizing them the same as these bodies used to provide liquidity during the pandemic shutdowns. On a bigger scale, there could be a national investment authority to protect and develop the collective good of public infrastructure, a third federal body alongside the Fed and the Treasury meant to provide a long-term capital needed for collective goods that the markets are too impatient to provide. I think Bhaskar and Sakara and Ben Burgess are talking about something like this in their reform program. At a smaller scale, the Biden administration used the Inflation Reduction Act to create a nigh bottomless well of tax credits for green infrastructure available directly to municipalities, which got the federal government to help reimburse some 60% of costs associated with capital projects. And yeah, that's cool. Maybe even more exciting, the IRA capitalized green banks to the tune of $27 billion. Green banks are one of the more hopeful structures available to us. They are like reverse charter schools, mobilizing private capital for public purposes like decarbonization, making private investment public, and they're the actually existing multi-criterial investment fund, not merely seeking profits, but also justice of various forms. But after what John Katz calls Biden's abortive social democracy, the second Trump administration has dismantled those promising programs and made bigger solutions impossible. Furthermore, they've used tax credit structure to publicly finance private schools and hobble public school districts while defunding healthcare provisions and any public program seen as woke. The budget cycle coming downstream from the Trump administration's new budget is already creating a bleak outlook for New York State, threatening a potential $10 billion shortfall as debt payments on barbs for New York City is nearly triple. Mamdani will have to put on the straitjacket just as other mayors have before him, but this time under the threat of losing significant federal support, which is why he played nice with Trump. Fools. Russell Vought, director of the United States Office of Budget and Management and the current Grim Reaper of federal spending, has already infamously canceled $18 billion for New York City infrastructure projects as part of Trump's MAGA federal spending massacre. That money was going to repay the bonds the city had already sold. Someone's going to have to pay them. The voters and taxpayers want to see Mamdani's vision become reality. If the voters and taxpayers want to see Mamdani's vision become reality. This is what awaits Democratic nominees if he wins, a cabal of capitalists looking to hold out municipal finance straitjacket like a reward for some hellish golf tournament, belting his administration's arms behind their backs. Maybe this is why James Carville, Ben Clinton's chief advisor, said famously that he wanted to die and be reincarnated as the bond market. You can intimidate everyone, he said. That Mamdani administration shouldn't be exclusively scared, but they should be aware of what's awaiting them. Houdini once got himself out of a straitjacket while suspended upside down above Times Square. The voters of America's biggest city may have to place their hopes that a similarly miraculous escape. Of course, however, Mamdani echoed Nelson Mandela when he won the primary. It always seems impossible until it's done. Yeah, but you have to actually spell out how you're going to do it. And so many of you don't want to look at this. I'm going to just say this. If you want to be a socialist, you actually do have to understand capitalist economics to the best of your ability and quit being a dipshit about it and just saying, tax the rich and we will have these social infrastructure things because you have to deal with the legal obligations which currently exist, which were designed by capitalists for capitalists about capitalists. It's a reality. The reason why I've always said focus on the legislature is they can actually do something about that. Ask in rewriting state constitutions, et cetera, et cetera. Municipalities cannot. Protect your peace.